Welcome to Prepper Nation. I am John. Happy Saturday. I know, Saturday, right, son? Thank y'all for being here, shooting a thumbs up, hitting subscribe, all that typical YouTube jazz. We got to talk about it, don't we? We have to talk about the Tucker interview. I know it's been a couple of days now. A lot of people were covering it yesterday, but as I like to do over here, I like to let things marinate. I like to have time to think about stuff that happens before I get on here and flap my lips, right? So the first thing I need to point out is within the first 12 hours of Tucker's interview posting, because it was on Twitter and it was on his website, but over on Twitter, within the first 12 hours, there were 104 million views. So I think it's safe to say at this point, mainstream media is dying. If not, it's already dead. Because there is no program that I can think of that pulls that kind of attention and that many eyeballs, if you will, within the span of 12 hours. And I'm sure there's a lot more by the time you're seeing this, but let's get into the interview, some of the things that were said. Many of you have seen it. Some of you didn't brave it because, like 2 hours, I did. I kind of made some cliff notes on it. And then at the end of this video, I want to explain what I think is really going on in that region now that we've heard both sides. We've heard the official side here in Western media, and we've heard from Mr. Z countless times, when he's ringing that bell saying, please give me your money because this is happening. Now we've heard the other side of the argument, even though I think it was John Kirby that came out just prior to this interview dropping. And he said, basically, don't listen to it. Don't listen to anything because you're dealing with the president of Russia here. So don't listen to anything. So do whatever you want. Listen to whichever side you want. Listen to both sides. Make your own mind up. That's the most important thing. But here's some takeaways from the interview. So the first, I don't know, 25, 30 minutes or so was a history lesson. It opened up with such a simple question by Tucker, and Putin went into like this, I don't know, it was around 30 minutes or so, folks. This history lesson, which was rather boring, to be honest with you, but I think what he was doing is he was making the claim that Russia has historical claim to parts of today's Ukraine. And he was trying to explain why. And he was also, I think he also brought all of this up because he wanted people in Western media to understand there was a world before the United States, which makes sense because a lot of people, especially here in America, it's almost like the world didn't exist before the United States. I guess a lot of Americans are arrogant in that way. There were a lot of things that happened before 1776 and the rise of the United States. And he's saying, for thousands of years, Russia was heavily involved in that area. And he believes deep down that they have historical claim to parts of Ukraine where they're currently occupying, and that the people there identify more as Russian as they do Ukrainian. But he goes on in the interview to say that NATO promised him, that we're not going to expand east. We're not headed your way. NATO is its own deal. And he said he was promised this, and NATO has expanded 5 times since then. So he's saying, not only did they break their word on this, they broke it 5 separate occasions. And every single time he went to the leaders of NATO, according to him, he went to the leaders of the Western world and said, we can't do this. We don't want you expanding eastward. Do whatever you want to over there. But you're kind of getting too close to Russia at this point. So he said he objected strongly. Russia as a country objected strongly. This was surprising to me. I didn't know this. He had told Tucker, he said Russia at one point in time considered joining NATO. And this was during the Clinton presidency. Bill Clinton. Sorry, Hillary fans. She was not the president. Bill Clinton, old Slick Willie. And he said he approached Bill Clinton And Bill Clinton told him, yeah, that shouldn't be a problem. I'll talk to some people and see what's going on. And he had spoken to him shortly after that, and he doesn't know exactly who Clinton was speaking with at that time, but he said Bill Clinton told him it's not possible. You're not ever going to be allowed in NATO. It is what it is. Um, he made another excellent point that I was not fully aware of, and I don't think a lot of people are fully aware of. He said when it comes to Ukraine, Mr. Z's country, as we have to call it sometimes here, because it is what it is. It's YouTube, right? He said that was one of their biggest trading partners. They're right next door. We trade back and forth. Russia's economy. I mean, Russia trades with the rest of Europe as well, but this is one of our biggest trading partners. And he said the EU actually moved in on Ukraine, and the EU has its own set of rules when it comes to commerce. And because the EU moved in, this began to affect um, the economy in Russia. A lot of Russians were being hurt by this economically because the trading totally changed, and that whole dynamic changed. And then the major implication here, he said that Z-Man's country back in 2014 underwent a coup, and basically overthrew everything, installed what you see there today. And he says specifically in this interview that coup is led by the CIA. He actually implicated them in a lot of stuff, folks. When you get right down to it, throughout this interview, he implicates that our president here in the United States is not in charge and hasn't been for a while now. And he's saying that he firmly believes the CIA is in charge. And we talk about this sometimes on the channel about the higher ups being compromised or maybe puppets. But we're always talking about foreign countries. Are they under the influence of Russia? Are they under the influence of China? Who are they under the influence? And he's saying it's actually the CIA. And he had no problem saying this. And I kind of got the feeling when he was talking about this discussion with Bill Clinton that Clinton said, "Yeah, I believe we can get you in NATO." And maybe he had spoken to the CIA and came back and said, "No, it's not happening." So that's, if you take him at his word on this, um, that's pretty scary to understand that you have a three-letter agency in charge of the country to that extent, to the point where they are overriding what the president, it's a stretch, but the duly elected official president, commander in chief, actually wants for the country. And he didn't come right out and say it, but he was insinuating this is why there's so much pushback against Donald Trump getting back into the White House, because when you have a strong president to push back against the CIA, it affects their day to day, is what he was pretty much trying to say, I think. He said that he personally discussed avoiding war with Western countries, specifically the United States, specifically, he mentioned Germany as well. And he asked for, and this was a big sticking point and a big reason that he gave for going into Ukraine. He asked for, during these discussions, all Third Reich groups in Ukraine to be outlawed. He said that there was a huge problem. And I've heard this, here and there, but I didn't know. Mainstream media likes to spin, so I didn't know if there was anything to it, but I heard it come out of his mouth last night, right? He asked for all of these groups. He said there's a high concentration of Third Reich ideology. Hopefully, y'all know what I mean when I say Third Reich ideology in Z-Man's country. And he said, it's Z-Man's country, not mine. However, we cannot have, because the Russians and the Third Reich, they fought during World War II, and a lot of bad things happened on both sides. And he's saying we cannot have these people right next door that want to do us so much harm, and just claim that Mr. Z's country is a hotbed for this type of activity. Um, he came right out and said, because sometimes we'll hear the argument even from our own government, oh, he's trying to reassemble the USSR, and he said he has zero interest in expanding throughout Europe. He said Russia has its own issues. They don't want to expand. They don't want to rebuild the USSR, but he said this is purposefully being fed to people like us in Western countries. This is propaganda that's being fed because they need a reason to continue sending money to Z-Man's country. And he's saying, essentially they've built a straw man, but he has zero ambition to rebuild the USSR. He said it goes against all common sense to provoke a global war. We're often told in our own media that Russia's trying to trigger, World War III and all of this stuff. And we have warmongers in DC that say if we don't put an end to it now, we're going to have to send, our men and women over there, our youngsters, to fight in this war because it's going to be a global war. And he's saying that's not what Russia wants. That goes against all common sense. Why would they want that? In fact, he said that Russia looks to avoid a global war, and that's what they've been trying to do from the jump. They started negotiating. He says he hasn't talked to Biden, though, since sometime in 2022, just because all communication has been cut off with them, with the Western powers. He still understands what's going on with the U.S., but he hasn't directly spoken to many of the leaders. But he's saying, hey, we don't want a global war. Nobody wins in a global war. And then he goes on to say, listen to this. Tell me that we haven't heard this in the community before. He goes on to say, Russia doesn't want a global war. And why would the United States be pushing for a global war? He says he thinks the U.S. or people that are in control of the U.S. are pushing for a global war. He said, again, nobody wins. He said America has its own issues at home between the border chaos and the national debt. He says, why would you want to get involved in a global war or a war in Europe or anything? If you're the United States, he says, nobody wins here. Tucker asked him about Nord Stream, asked him point blank, who took out the pipeline? And he said the CIA. Straight up. He said, we've got evidence that the CIA did it. But he goes on to say the problem is they're very limited in the message that they can put out because the USA controls most of the world's media, including much of Europe. So anytime they release something, it's just going to be drowned out anyway. By this, to give you a perfect example of why I think he is telling the truth on that, us controlling all of the media or most of the media around the world. This interview, again, 100+ million people tuned in for this thing. It was the biggest story. It's trending all over social media. But I went to every single mainstream media website right before this thing was going to go down, while this thing was on. Fox News did not mention it. CNN did not mention it. MSNBC did not mention it. No mention on BBC. No mention on Sky News whatsoever. Like this interview never took place or wasn't happening. So I do think that we control and manipulate, not us, but the powers that be control and manipulate a lot of the world media. He makes a very telling statement. He says the U.S. Dollar is the cornerstone of America's power. And he said the U.S. dollar is dying. So what he's saying here is America's power, global power, is fading. And he understands this. Again, he made another reference to 2014, the coup. He said since that moment, He's constantly and repeatedly sought peace, sued for peace, tried to talk to multiple national leaders, including the United States, a bunch. No one listens. He says either no one wants to hear it because they have their own agenda, or he says they'll tell him one thing, and then the documents seem to go in the trash once they get done with their meeting, and they do the total opposite. Um, and he goes on to say that NATO began putting bases in Mr. Z's country, and he said this was the line in the sand for him. They've expanded eastward 5 times after they promised they would not do it one time. And they refuse to do anything about the Third Reich ideology that's on their doorstep. Now NATO is putting bases right on their border, and he said we can't have that. If this means we go to war, we go to war at this point. Um, so take it with a grain of salt, obviously, because the man is former KGB. I will say he gives a much more presidential interview than Joe Biden. I'm just saying. I'm just saying he was very tactful in his responses and things. And I wish Tucker would have asked more questions. And then again, that 30 minutes was like, wow, really, man? But he did ask some important questions. He was very blunt. He wasn't throwing softball pitches. Here's what I think is happening in that region. This is my opinion. This is my takeaway after hearing both sides. I think the West is trying to weaken Russia with this war. It's obviously a proxy war, okay? We're fighting Russia indirectly. We are, Australia is, Germany, which is the number 2 financial backer, Great Britain. We are trying to weaken Russia because we realize Russia is rising on the world stage, and we're trying to stop that from happening. We put sanctions on them. The sanctions don't seem to work. So the only way that we can weaken them is through just a prolonged war that's not going to be very popular in Russia. So the West is trying to weaken Russia with this war. On the flip side, Russia realizes that the U.S. dollar is dying. And I think they're trying to hang in there as long as they can because they think they can outlast the United States dollar. They're just sitting around waiting for it to crash. He said something very, very telling toward the end of this interview. He made a reference to the Roman Empire, the ancient Roman Empire. And he was talking about the United States. Make no mistake about it. We've talked about it here before. He said, the difference is with the ancient Roman Empire, it took centuries for it to fall. They got overpopulated. He mentioned the barbarians. He said the barbarians began to grow economically, and they eventually just overthrew the existing system. And with the United States, he's making this reference because he said it's happening. He did his hands in some weird way. He said it's happening very quickly. And so I think maybe he either believes the United States is going to fall and soon, or at the very least, he believes the United States is going to fall from the number 1 spot on the global stage very, very soon. And so he has no problem with a prolonged war when you get right down to it. I mean, I don't know what side of the fence you folks are on either way. It doesn't really matter. I wish we would just keep our butts at home. I've said this, and focus on America first. But I am glad that both sides of the story are out there. And he said ultimately Ukraine is suffering. He said countless people have died and it didn't need to happen. And he's saying we're trying to protect some of the minorities in that region that we've taken because they're being targeted by groups that have Third Reich ideology. And, he said, we just can't allow it. We cannot allow. He said the mustache man from World War II is long gone, but his beliefs are still there, and they're right next door. And that with combined with NATO military bases, he said, we're not putting up with it. At some point, it crossed the line and we had to take action. So that's his viewpoint. I don't know. Y'all let me know what you think in the comments if you don't mind. Have a great Saturday. Take care. God bless.